Everything in life is always striving towards a better experience or a better position. Whether it's animals moving from one point to another geographic point in order to live in a more favorable habitat during the changing seasons, or us as human beings trying to change our environment, trying to change the house we live in into a bigger, more comfortable house, or perhaps trying to change our jobs to do something more fulfilling or something that pays more, or whatever it may be. We are always striving, or life in itself is always fundamentally striving and changing to, at the very least, a more optimal position. And from that more optimal position, life is always sifting through, trying to filter out ways to continue to progress into a better experience even further. And so when I say life, I definitely include human beings. Human beings are life. Or you may see it as a piece of life, or you may see life as an entirety whereby humans exist within this life. But essentially, there is always a strive towards a better experience. Now, this strive towards a better experience is obviously done through change. This is very interesting when we interact with different individuals and our environment. When we come by a certain experience, when we come by a certain situation, or when we speak to a certain individual, if something seems off within our paradigm, within our perspective, what we try to do, or what we tend to try and do, is to change aspects of the environment, aspects of our surroundings, in order to receive results that is in alignment with what we want, in alignment with our perspective. Now, this is very interesting because this is perhaps one of the biggest causes to suffering. We suffer and we are overwhelmed by life because we are constantly trying to change everything around us. Best behold that we actually cannot change that much around us. We may be able to change certain things within our means, within our proximity. We can change the house we live in into a bigger house and feel more comfortable. We can change our jobs into a more satisfying job or a higher paid job. We can change the people we hang around with. There are many aspects around us that we can perhaps change. But if we rely in the change of our environment in order to live a more fulfilled life, we will eventually spiral ourselves into a place of suffering. And that's because the ability for us to change our environment plateaus. There comes a point where you cannot change your environment. For example, you are speaking to an individual, and this individual you really care about, you really love, and they did something that you're not quite happy about. They lied to you, or they told you a certain thing, or they judged you, or they hurt you, and you're not happy about that. And of course you love this person, and you know that this person will always, or at least be within your experience for a long time. And so you striving to try and change this individual is essentially you trying to better your environment ultimately, where the initial conscious excuse is that we want to change this individual for them because we love them and because we care about them. And so, since we are touching upon love, and love is really a theme in this, we've got to come to terms with the fact that we cannot change everyone. If we want to live a life where we are not satisfied, where we aren't fulfilled, then we should try and change every single person. We should try and tell every single person that this is the way to do this. This is the way to say this. This is the way anything should be done or looked at. Now, if we are fortunate enough, we can very quickly become aware of this plateau of changing our environment, or of the ability to change our environment. So what we do now is we look at different ways to go about it, to still live a fulfilled life, to still live within a satisfied experience of life. At this point, what we tend to do is we naturally begin to reflect. And as we begin to reflect, we realize that perhaps instead of changing our environment, we've got to change ourselves. Realistically, when we really look at the situation, when we really look at life, when we really look at ourselves and the environment, we realize that the only thing that we really can change is ourselves. This can open a very deep discussion as to what anyone considers as themselves. You can change your body in certain ways. You can change the tone of your voice. You can change other aspects of what you may consider yourself. But when I say yourself, the closest thing to describe what I mean here would be your perspective. You can always change your perspective. Your perspective is like the goggles or the lenses that you put on. And because it's something that you put on, there is ultimately a decision of what sort of lens you want to put on. And so with what comes with changing ourselves comes the autonomy to be able to change the perspective. So instead of us trying to change the person that has hurt us by judging us or lying to us, what we can do is we can see perhaps this fault within the person, whether it is that they are lying or that they are judging. What we can do is we can ultimately learn this lesson and apply it to ourselves. So here at this point, we are changing our perspective, we are taking on board the lesson, and we are teaching ourselves not to lie, and we are teaching ourselves not to be judgmental. This approach may not necessarily be satisfactory for a lot of us because, okay, we have changed ourselves, but we haven't changed our environment. But this is the beauty here. Whatever your inner environment is like, is projected outwards into the external environment. Even though in this sort of description, the inner and outer environment are described as separate, they are ultimately not separate. It is all one paradigm or one dimension, but essentially it starts from within us. So as we change our perspective, our outer environment manifests itself. It's as though our perspective is the initial projector that shines the light onto the screen that then plays your environment, that plays your life. Now, on that note, going back to the point where we try to change our environment out of love, we try to change different individuals that we care about out of love. If we really look at this closely, we can notice that truly the most loving thing we can do is change ourselves, even when interacting with someone that we feel is perhaps suffering. If we can change ourselves and change our perspective, then us being within the proximity of the other individual, we are offering the opportunity for the other individual to join this perspective without trying to convince anyone anything. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that, let's say you are hanging out with a very judgmental person. This person is constantly judging people in a negative way. Oh, he did this thing and she did this and whatever, right? And so immediately as you see that this sort of perspective that this individual carries may not necessarily serve them, when this individual is speaking to you, they may quickly notice that perhaps you do not carry such a perspective because it doesn't serve you. And so the individual will naturally be less inclined to take on such a perspective, and they will match the way you view life, as they can see that your perspective is projecting a lot less suffering into the world, essentially, compared to their perspective. Another way of putting it is you are being an example to the people around you. And so by us changing ourselves, we are doing a much greater service than us trying to change others. By us changing ourselves, we are doing a much greater service to our environment in general, let alone others. But of course, in order for us to be able to change ourselves, there is a prerequisite. And that is, just as we touched upon earlier, it's love. If we cannot love ourselves, then how can we love others? And very often when we talk and touch upon the concept or the idea of self-love, many people may see this as selfish, as in you only do things for yourself. You are selfish in the way where you lack the generosity. You don't care about others. You do not include others. No, this type of self-love is an unconditional love that isn't a take type of love. It's a type of love that radiates from inwards out. Now this very self-love that radiates outwards will initiate a knock-on effect on your surroundings immediately. People around you will be rubbed off by this love and may shift their perspective within themselves. It will give them a sort of hope that they do not have to hold on to the perspectives that don't serve them, because as I mentioned earlier, you are now being an example. That self-love, the unconditional self-love, is perhaps a better perspective, or is perhaps a better position to be in. And it is sold on its own. You are not there standing on a big stage telling people, you've got to love yourself, you've got to love yourself. It just rubs off naturally, and it just happens. And the beauty in this self-love is that it can really grow. The extent to which it can grow but essentially it will eventually anchor you into the moment, and it will naturally be the fuel that shifts your perspective, that changes your perspective. You will start to see everything in a more loving way. and as you see everything in a more loving way, you will naturally come to intellectual conclusions that just happen to be more loving. And it makes sense, right? If you are in a very bad mood, everything just seems like hell. Nothing seems to go like it's going right. Everything just seems like it's working against you. But of course, if we nurture this self-love, the unconditional type of self-love, by letting go of our rigid perspectives and view matters in a more loving way, view ourselves in a more loving way, coming to terms with our perspective, we will eventually live a more loving, satisfied experience. If I could put this entire explanation or this entire video into one sentence, it would be to love yourself selflessly.